I'm happy to present on my actually new book that just came out last month, the EU Migrant Generation in Asia, Middle Class Aspirations in Asian Global Cities. So what is this a story of? This is a story of young EU citizens who migrated to Asian economic hubs in 2010. And what I argue in this book is that they search for middle-class distinction in a time where the EU did not present the same attainable goals anymore as to their parent generation. So for this book, I conducted research with a focused main group of 70 European migrants in Singapore and in Tokyo over a course of about 7 years, from 2014 onwards. At the end of the research, in 2021, more than half of this group were still in the two cities that I'm talking about, and others had moved on to other cities. Few had returned to their hometowns. So what I argue is that the implications of their early career migration at a certain life stage, very early on in their career, have affected a more long-term migration at a time that mobility was both celebrated globally, but also became more restrictive and ending, of course, with the COVID pandemic also becoming almost impossible. So Singapore and Tokyo, as I will demonstrate, have also shifted tremendously in their reception of migrants from the ideal country and immigration state Singapore and the so far often seen as non-immigrant country, Japan, and within it, the city Tokyo. But as a brief background to the research on which I'm building, when we talk about Europeans, and Robert already said it, the term migrant is very rarely used. What is usually said is sojourners, travelers, maybe lifestyle, retirees, and often the word expatriates. And probably the most iconic picture to show this would be these two elderly white men in suits somewhere in Singapore. In more recent research, we see that Europeans are also portrayed as migrants sometimes, then they would be lifestyle seekers somewhere in the south, southern Europe, or maybe the global south. But it is then more recent research of the late 2000s and 2010s that has actually picked on Europeans being migrants themselves, of course, as everyone who moves countries and borders, especially student migration within the EU, where we have many established exchange programs, but also so-called self-initiated migrants who have been quite famously depicted by Adrian Fabel in 2008 as the Eurostars, people who within the EU, where they don't need a visa to reside and work in a different country, move countries, take on new jobs, and lead middle-class lifestyles. And then the most probably recent, very critical research coming from critical race studies, and sometimes also called whiteness studies, that picks up the notion that Europeans are usually portrayed as skilled people if they're abroad, and questioning this skill and how the assumption of skill is tied to nationality, to race, to ethnicity. And this is where the study sets on. I'm focusing on a very distinct group of young people, mostly recent university graduates, who self-initiate their migration to Asian cities. And I do this at the case of Singapore and Tokyo. And just maybe as a visualization of what I mean, this would be a job hunting event in Tokyo, where you can easily see that this person will probably face some different issues than her peers around her. But as a background to the EU, what do I talk about when I talk about EU and EU citizenship? These people grew up at a time of the EU enlargement, where the EU territory and the Schengen territory, which is even encompasses more countries like Switzerland that are not part of the EU, was growing constantly, where free movement was becoming normal, was celebrated, and meant that people could reside and work anywhere within the territory without needing a visa, and where especially exchange programs, student internship programs were expanding tremendously, and the Erasmus program is probably the most well-known of these. This was also a time that European institutions celebrated and really outspokenly promoted mobility as something good, something desirable, and did so by, on the right-hand side again, we can see by calling on the attractions of the different countries, cities, and places that one could explore, that could enrich one's lives, and it might, as often tacitly or sometimes directly said, also increase people's employability on the job market. But also the time, starting most well known probably with 2008 Lehman shock and the unfolding economic and financial crisis, a time where Europe did not present such a safe haven as it used to be anymore. A time where Asia was on the rise, especially speaking of China and India, but of course the whole Southeast Asian region is an extremely dynamic populous region, and where, as in the words of one of my informants, staying abroad could be useful for my future career. And this staying abroad evolved from a first small stay abroad in a neighboring country to further longer stays to a movement out of Europe and to Asia. So I call these people the EU generation. Knowing that, of course, it doesn't cover a whole generation, but within the millennial generation of those who became adults in the 2000s, who entered the labor market towards the late 2000s, early 2010s, within a time of EU enlargement, this specific, highly educated group from European middle classes experienced onwards and longer-term mobility during their youth, experienced the celebration of mobility as something that should enrich one's lives, and also experienced how the EU became hit by several crises. The economic crisis, but also a crisis of EU institutions, among which the refugee crisis hit the trust in Europe's future, and unfolding Brexit and so on also questioned the stability of the future in the EU. So spatial mobility was celebrated as something desirable, as I said, natural and maybe advantageous as well, and was becoming a norm for those who were circulating within university circles, Erasmus migration programs, whose parents could afford traveling and who had experienced being abroad for several times. And just to show some statistics on that, the blue line here demonstrates the total EU unemployment of young people during the years 2005 to 2019. You can see the peak after 2008, usually around 2010 and 11, 12 for many countries, with some European, like Southern European countries, like Spain or Portugal, even hitting more like a 30 or 50% mark of youth unemployment, the total being more than one-fourth. So, as the methods and data that I applied to do the study, this was a multi-sided ethnography. I was based in Tokyo, and I went on and off to Singapore for a course of 6 years, and then continued with online research when the pandemic had started. Mostly semi-structured interviews and follow-ups, but also many ethnographic observations, visiting the same job hunting events, visiting networking events for business reasons, but also spending time with these people in their free time to see who they socialize with. The profile of the group are 70 people who were between 25 and 35 at the first time I met them, but I followed up, as I said. So I followed most of these people for their early life stage in their 20s and 30s, a time where they first transitioned into the job market, and then transitioned jobs and transitioned life stage, as I will explain. And what they have in common is that they are all university educated and they work full-time on local jobs. They are not expatriates, they are not sent from the EU, but initiated their stays in Asia by themselves. Now the question, of course, why Asia? What does Asia hold in store for these young Europeans? As a brief explanation about Singapore, that was one of my field sites. Singapore is an extremely young country that became fully independent in 1965, so it's just a bit more than 50 years of history. Within these 50 years, this immigrant country has moved from a small tropical island country without any resources to one of the ones with the highest GDP per capita in the world. It is a business center, a business hub with lots of multinational companies. It has an extremely diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual population, but few ethnic tensions until recently. And as I already said, it's a country of immigration with the foreign population more than 1/3. However, within this foreign population, we can see that this is an often called bifurcated migration regime. So we have people on the top who are seen as skilled migrants and who are given generous rights, living usually on relatively good salaries. And then we have the lowest-waged labor migrants that are heavily surveyed. And as already said, the country managed for almost 50 years to have very stable cohesion in society, few ethnic tensions, and this has changed after the influx of migrants increased to such huge numbers in the 2000s that the government, for the first time after 50 years, lost many seats in the votes, and the immigration policies became much stricter. We will see how this has affected recent migration to Singapore. And then we have Tokyo, a global city within Japan that has diversified from within in recent decades. So after, and I think everyone is very well aware of this, after the 200 years of limited engagement with the world and this myth of ethnic homogeneity, and the reluctance to talk about immigration issues, but probably about foreigners, Gaikokujin, but not immigrants, the rhetoric has changed recently. After the burst of the bubble economy and after several decades of economic stagnation, we have seen that Japanese society has changed quite significantly. The middle class has been replaced by the so-called gap society. A huge influx, still in relative terms, of course relatively small, but if we look at statistics, a huge influx actually of foreigners from all around the world. And with this, an expansion of visa categories and a socio-cultural diversification, especially of Tokyo, but of course also of some other places in Japan. Research then has talked about foreigners always staying others in Japan. And if we look at research on Europeans, or generally as those that are seen as private as whites, we can see that they have enjoyed various sorts of benefits in the country. However, that exactly that turns them into the always notorious others who cannot really integrate or incorporate into Japanese society. So as to just briefly look at the group that I've been talking about, which I've been researching, so EU citizens between 25 and 34 in Japan, their numbers have been increasing. It's not a huge, but it's a relatively constant increase, except 2011 triple disaster. And their distribution within Japan, the dark gray bar representing the total Japan, and then with the next one on the right, mid-dark one representing Tokyo. So we can see that almost half of all EU citizens actually live in Tokyo, and their numbers have been increasing over the years until 2020. So what I'm doing now is I'm introducing 4 different types that I created in order to kind of lay out the patterns of what kind of people move. Going out from the EU as the place of embarkment and which cities they choose as destinations, why, and how they access work there. So the first type that I'm talking about is who I call the lifestyle seekers, who would usually be young Europeans who have already worked in the EU for a few years, mostly in their home countries, and who at some point decide they want to change in their life, and the change should be something that is really different, not as anything in the EU that they already know from some study abroad programs and travels. So, as the quote of one of my informants, we wanted to go on a big adventure. And so as a couple, they just sold their belongings and they moved to Singapore, with the idea in the back of their minds, if it doesn't work out, you can always go home. So these people do not search the big career. They want to change. They want a lifestyle change. They want something that is more appealing than what they see what their peers are doing. Getting jobs, getting married, or building houses, having kids. So what they do is they move to a country that seems accessible but differently enough, which more often is Singapore than Japan or Tokyo within. Singapore using English as an official language in business, and having lots of European institutions and organizations within which some of these people find their jobs. So life in Europe is put on a hold indefinitely. There is usually no clear idea of when people will move back or if they move back, but it is also seen as a phase, as one adventure, as we can see here in the life. The next type is a very distinct one, and these are the cultural enthusiasts. And I read out the quote of this Northern European woman. I just wanted to get better at the Japanese language, you know, not like shumikeke, not like a hobby. So I decided to enter university and study Japan studies, you know, as a semonta, as a professional. So for these people, it is about Japan, about the country, which they find appealing for some cultural reason. It might be manga, but it might also be the language. It might be some old traditional Japanese culture. So what they do is the more they know about this country, and they find it usually appealing in their youth as children or as high school students, they start studying the language because very soon they understand that without the Japanese language, they will not really understand the country. So most of these young Europeans have studied Japanese, maybe at university, maybe as an exchange student. Some have even entered degree-seeking programs here in Japan. And when they graduate, they follow their Japanese peers, doing the job hunting, getting jobs on April 1st, entering the same kind of employment system as Japanese young people would do. They've usually moved alone, as I said, as students at a very young age. And so their goal is not the job in Japan, but it is the possibility to stay, to be in Japan, to live in Japan, for which they need a visa, for which they need a job. And as a third type, the so-called global professionals, these are again a quite different and a very diverse group. So here I talked to about women who moved alone, people of migrant background in Europe, gay people. So a really diverse group who decided at a quite early point that the career that they had envisioned, inspirational surroundings, interesting people, were something that they would not find in Europe. So this French Arabic woman said, as a lawyer in France, your prospects internationally wise are limited. And I wanted to have a I wanted to have a more international career. And then she talks about how she compares to Europe as someone with a migrant background. You know, when you arrive here in Singapore, when you cross the border, people will never look at you like, oh, we don't need you, or something like that. They give you a chance to succeed. So for these people, it is about the career. It was not necessarily about the high salaries, but it is about being in what I call international surroundings, having more chances in a more dynamic work environment than they see they have in Europe, not being judged so much. So for example, young women moving alone and finding career opportunities in Singapore is something quite distinct about this group. And many of them re-migrate. They might not start in Singapore, they might start in a Chinese city, but they might move to Singapore, and they might move on, usually not back to their home countries. And as the last type, and I have to say this is a minority in the group, but an important one, these are the precarious movers. And these are the ones who just did not, they probably showed up in the statistics I showed before, they didn't find a job, despite being highly educated, usually with an MA degree. Like this Portuguese man who said, it was a bad time in Europe and the world and for an architect. So I was applying for all kinds of jobs. And I was a little bit desperate because at that time, I was waking up and still living with my mom. your self-esteem goes down, you start questioning yourself. So for them, it was the economic crisis that really pushed them out, not only of their own countries, but of Europe. They are mostly from Southern European countries, but also Eastern European countries, Northern European countries, the fringes of the European continent. And they bought flight tickets and left, as in the case of this person who had the possibility to stay on a tourist visa for 3 months in Singapore, stayed at friends' couches, and after 2.5 months found a job and got a visa. But still, and what we can see here applies to this group, they come from middle-class families. It's not like they would not have any living back in Europe. They could have stayed with their parents. They could have probably worked in some jobs. But that's not what they wanted. They were highly educated. They had different successes in their lives so far, scholarships, having studied abroad, speaking several languages. So then, in the end, somewhere in Asia where they could get a job in their field was the more attractive option. So how are these people integrated in the labor market? This is very complex, so I'm just giving a very broad and short summary, and if there are questions, then probably we can talk about those later in the Q&A. But just to show the differences and the major characteristics. So for Singapore, access to the job market was, as I already mentioned, often through European-related companies. It might be European companies, it might be Asian companies with some trade or some interest in accessing European markets. In Tokyo, the bulk of people started out with being recruited as new graduates, never having worked before, entry-level jobs on the job training together with Japanese. In terms of the industry, the typical industries that are the major industries in both countries, so in Singapore mostly logistics, IT, architecture, consulting and so on. In Tokyo more often manufacturing, of course also translation, but then also renewable energies, IT and so on. For the employment conditions, the ones in Singapore are often in these multinational firms, so in a very international work environment. And these companies usually represent regional headquarters, whereas in Japanese firms, in the Japanese labor market, there are two groups. There are the ones who, as I just said, enter as new graduates. They often speak Japanese on a quite high level, and these are the ones who enter the Japanese firms, because they have learned during their time, during their study time, during their previous time in Japan, that this is what gains them credibility in this country, where they learn the Japanese business environment and where they have stable jobs. So they are Seishain permanent employees. And then those who don't want to or can't, because they don't have the Japanese language proficiency, can't enter Japanese firms. They would start working in foreign firms, and then they're almost always contract workers, Keyakushain for maybe 2 or 3 years, which of course also again means the visa is bound to that. The characteristics of the incorporation, and here is a huge difference, is that in Singapore, as I mentioned earlier, the migration, the visa system has become stricter and stricter over the years. So nowadays a skilled employment pass, it's called a visa, skilled visa, is usually given for 2 or 3 years, and it gets harder and harder to get it renewed. Permanent residency, which used to be relatively easily attainable for skilled migrants, is almost impossible to get these days. So this means for people that their labor market incorporation is extremely insecure, and they live with a transience that they know within 2 years, if they cannot achieve an upward career in terms of higher salary or a higher position, it is likely they won't get their visa renewed. So they make sure that they are employable. They are employable globally in a very international business context. Whereas in Japan, we have almost the opposite in the sense that people who work, especially in Japanese firms, but even in international firms, these would be often very Japanese in the way business is done, and who their colleagues and bosses are. They struggled a lot with the language barrier in the beginning, with all the tacit rules they didn't know. Some struggled with a certain tokenism, being usually the only foreigner or the only visible foreigner, non-East Asian foreigner in this firm. But if they don't quit after a few years, they get over the biggest struggles, and they have these indefinite jobs, or even if they are employed as contract workers, they over time know they will get a new job even if they quit. They will get a new visa with the new job. They don't need to worry that they will be kicked out of the country. And I will talk more about that in a second. And a last important point are gender dynamics. Interestingly, in Singapore, quite a few people, women especially, talked about their perception of having more career chances in Singapore than back in Europe. They compare especially to more conservative or more religious European countries, but they in general see that if they are young and able to work and skilled, people don't make a difference. And we could probably see that with the earlier quote. It doesn't matter how you look like, it doesn't matter who you are. If you are skilled and you put in your work, you can make it. That's the idea. It changes though with family considerations, and it changes when kids come in, because those kinds of jobs are not flexible. Those kind of middle-class people who don't have extremely high salaries, don't have relatives in the country, don't have anyone who could help them with child rearing, it's extremely difficult to arrange for jobs and to find, let's say, the same social welfare services that they would have in Europe. And in Tokyo, we have a quite different picture, because women from the beginning onwards are quite insecure about their career development, about the glass ceiling they have heard of and they are experiencing themselves much more than men. And so the career itself, but especially, again, the question of having children and raising a family are big question marks. So now to just briefly show two cases of how these people, what their assets are and how they're able to develop careers. The first one is about a French woman I interviewed in Singapore several times. She started working in Shanghai, and after a few years in small firms that were quite unstable, she was not very happy. She found a job offer by a Taiwanese firm that wanted someone for the European trade in Singapore. So for her, having worked in Shanghai for a few years, speaking a bit of Chinese, speaking English, being a French native speaker, and coming from Europe, so looking like a European, having a degree from Europe, she was interesting for this firm. For her, it was a salary increase. For her, it was a quite steep career change. But this also was only the case because she kind of could represent what that company was searching for. She could kind of represent Europe. She had some business experience. She spoke a bit of Chinese, better than nothing. And she was willing to move on the spot to Singapore. So this kind of mobility capital, as it is sometimes called, that these people accumulate over their career changes, over the geographical movements they do, help them in the end to also access or maybe move upwards in the labor market. Having not much of economic capital, but having these degrees, language proficiency, and also this symbolic value of coming from Europe. A very different example is that of a Greek man in Tokyo who started working after his MA in Tokyo in a French firm. He was able to slowly advance his career, and at some point when he wasn't struggling with the language anymore, he changed firms again and again. But being married to a Japanese wife, for him it was clear he would stay in Japan. So it's the other way around in this case, that he stayed immobile, he stayed in Tokyo, but was able to do so because he could leverage again on his Europeanness, English, Greek, which he didn't use, but some French, but then also over the years a very good proficiency, very high proficiency in Japanese. And then the stability that his Japanese family gave him in terms of the visa, incorporation and in a family network, which allowed him also to take a bank loan when he got permanent residency and buy an apartment. So for him it was, again, working himself through this European symbolic capital and getting more incorporated in the Japanese labor market that made it possible for him to stay and to move upwards with career. So now for a kind of closing picture, because the labor market incorporation alone doesn't tell us a lot about why people move or stay. I want to take a look at intimacy, but also of these people's emplacement in the two cities they are residing in. What we can see in terms of the social networks and people socializing in the two cities is for Singapore, and this might be relatively obvious, Singapore being an immigrant country and an extremely diverse international business place, they are socializing in what they call international networks. And the interesting part about this is that they are international in the sense that they are ethnically really diverse networks. So the majority of immigrants in Singapore comes from Asia. And this is also how their networks look like, how their friendships and social groups look like. However, they are classed. So these people in their networks are all professionals, Singaporeans who have worked abroad, foreigners from Asia, but also from around the world, who lead this kind of lifestyle that probably comes closest to what I talked about the global professionals who want to have an international exposure, a lifestyle with like-minded people who value mobility. Whereas in Tokyo, we see a large separation between two different groups these people socialize with. One would usually be either from their own home country or from a larger European community, and the other one would be their Japanese friends, who often don't speak English and with who they communicate in Japanese. So the people in Tokyo, as I said already, have invested a lot in making it in Japan, in the language, in trying to get deeper into society, and are often frustrated over the years that it is not possible to kind of integrate as much as they wanted. So they are always in between this wish to belong to society and then also to the idea that the longer they stay in Japan, the harder it might actually get to find a job elsewhere, to maybe return or to further propel their careers, because they do see a glass ceiling, no matter how relatively easier it gets to get a new job or change jobs, but they do see a glass ceiling. So in the end, no matter if people move again or if they stay, they always think about these options. They always weigh the idea of moving on, seldom of returning, or of staying, and so this is a conscious practice. If they move on, it is often for the career. If they stay, it is more often after years that they stop trying to integrate, but it is rather that they know the city, they know the life, they have their networks, they socialize with some parts of society, not with others, and they are increasingly fine with that, because moving again would mean uprooting themselves again, and they have often not worked in their home countries, not even once, or just for a very short time. So it is also a certain anxiety of moving again and leaving the place that they have known for a few years. But those who do return usually do so because of family considerations and because of the proximity. They want to be closer to their aging parents. So to close, I want to give 3 short examples of how different intimacy constellations affect how people think about their careers, but also the place of living and then decide. And the first one is a French couple, both French, dual career. He is in IT, she is in health, and they left France and he moved to Singapore in 2012. They're still there. He wanted to have an MBA, wanted to get it in Singapore because he saw Asia as the rising continent at that time. After his MBA, his wife followed, was working in a huge company, whereas he was working at certain smaller local companies in the IT sector, where he faced a lot of troubles. These companies were usually operated by ethnic Chinese people, where actually Chinese language did matter or was important, although the country is an English-speaking country. So he faced on and off turnover, was fired once, but his wife had a stable career for a longer time. And at some point, they said they wanted to stay, and they applied for permanent residency and were rejected. And then they applied again. I think first he applied, he was rejected. Later she applied, she was rejected. So then they thought about their options. Would they go back to the EU? But that was about in 2015-16. It was the peak of the refugee crisis. Taxes are high, salaries are higher in Singapore, taxes are lower in Singapore. They didn't really see any attractive options back. So they stayed, they tried again for PR. PR is inaccessible. So what this couple did is that they swapped, what you would say in migration research, the role of the lead migrant and the follower. One of two usually had a stable job that could provide for the others for the partner's visa. And this is how they have been going for the past 10, 11 years. They're still in Singapore, and they're still trying to navigate the challenges of this increasingly difficult and constraining visa system, because they don't really know how to move back or what they would do if they move back. The next one is an example about binational couples. So these could be a European married to a Japanese or a Singaporean citizen, but also, of course, a European married to another Asian citizen or someone from a different European country. And here it gets complex. So this quote is from a French woman married to a Korean and living here in Tokyo. In our case, I think if I was not with him, I would be back in France already. I'm always a little bit tired of Japanese society. In our case, we are kind of stuck in Japan because it's the only place where we can both find work. So their language of communication is Japanese. They don't speak each other's language well. They depend on the work visa, which means they're not really secure here in this country, but they don't see any other options. So what they do is they strategically accumulate skills in order to stay employable in the country. And in case of Asian European couples, they would often stay in Asia. And this is then bound to the language fact that usually the Asian partner is not as fluent in English or a European language, but also, for example, in Singapore, to religious issues, because Singapore is a multi-religious place where, for example, a Muslim can live easily and doesn't see the same in Europe. And for those who are both from European countries, the question gets very difficult. For example, to a couple who come from Portugal and Italy, where should they return to? Neither of them speaks both languages. England is out of the EU nowadays, which for many is discouraging. The probably quite good economy would be Germany, but who speaks German? So they stay. And then, as the last one, because not everyone is in a stable relationship, and of course this again affects how people independently move and move and move on again. And so this quote is from an Italian woman who was in Tokyo for about 3 years and who moved back to France, to Paris, where she had earlier on studied during her MA, after she had done several internships and shorter study abroad periods in Germany and other European countries. So this Italian woman back in France in a Zoom interview said, "I felt more professional and advanced in my position in Tokyo. I felt that I was more special there than now, having experienced something that not everybody has achieved, statistically speaking. Whereas in Paris there are plenty of Italian, Spanish, etc. It's less challenging to think about. Whereas living in Japan, maybe even being there, it was kind of proof to myself. I managed something. Not great, but important. It was good for me." So for her, she was not happy with her job. She didn't speak Japanese well. She didn't have a partner. She was quite insecure about her position. So the question came quite soon that she would move on. But where to? The Italian economy is not doing well. She speaks French fluently. So in the end, she moved back to France. But then the reflections are quite interesting. So for her, Asia had something that she could only attain in Asia and not in Europe, where she has the same degree, the same language skills, the same mobility experiences as everyone around her. So these people often move on, but again, family often brings them back to Europe, but then to some of the larger metropolitan cities in Europe and seldom to their home countries. So how to conclude? About Singapore and Tokyo as early career destinations. The first point is that this is a migration phenomenon that is not about moving to Japan, but about Tokyo. It's not about moving to Singapore, it's about moving to a hub in the Asian Pacific region. And both of them promise a high quality of life and a cosmopolitan outlook that these people, interestingly, having moved so much in Europe, do not see they can attain in Europe. Then also, the diametrical change of skilled migration policies means that the ideal immigrant country, Singapore, is nowadays seen by people and experienced by skilled migrants even as a quite unwelcoming place, not in the first instance, very open, very welcoming, easy to live and to settle, but no matter what they do, they don't see a future. They don't see that they can stay and actually build families and a life there. So even though they stay on, they don't see it as a place to stay for the long term. So they feel insecure, whereas in Tokyo, that used to be seen as a non-immigrant country, people struggle a lot, but those who stay, they manage to somehow find their foot in the labor market. They even propel their careers to some extent, and they find the networks and the legal status to stay for a longer time. So these kind of middling migrants are in the middle in position somewhere in the labor market. The possibilities to stay usually means they change jobs on and on in order to not change country, but to stay in the place where they are. And gender is a huge factor that in the end influences a lot how people decide on their onwards mobility. Gender inequality is more pronounced in Tokyo than in Singapore, but in the end, for those who want to stay in their jobs when having children, both countries do not really offer options for these middle-class people who cannot employ, for example, their domestic living workers, as many families in Singapore would do, and who do not have any relatives around. And here again is where the difference comes in. So those who are married, who lead international marriages, are more likely to stay in their current place of being. However, if the European is a woman, she would often want to move back. And these are the couples who often move back to Europe when they want to have kids. Whereas when the European is the man and the wife is an Asian wife, then they would usually raise their kids in Tokyo or in Singapore and rely on the wife's relatives and networks. So this is where gender changes on what's career migratory pathways, and we can see that the life stage is crucial for the time that these people find their long-term spouses and partners, but also for the labor markets in which they build their skills, and which affect if they stay, and that do many stay a long term. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the microphone. Thank you very much. I have lots of questions, but first and foremost, we'll open it to the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I will recognize you or not recognize you because this is democratic centralism. And then you can ask your questions. So Gabor, you raise your hand first.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. And my question is for Europeans living in Europe and choosing to stay being migrant, is Singapore and Tokyo is the obvious, or Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia is the obvious choice, or are there other places in the world like, I don't know, Latin America, Australia, whatever, or did you do any research? Or or really Japan and Singapore is dominant within?
Thanks for the question. Yes, I guess very important because my research has focused on Asia, but of course people also move elsewhere. So what, from other research that has been conducted, what we can see is, of course, the US is an attractive option, but one that is very difficult to access in terms of the visa. So that is a huge obstacle for people. You see Europeans moving to other places as well. What is quite interesting, because that certain time and that certain age group that I looked at this time you could see especially Spanish-speaking people, so mostly from Spain, moving to South America. So there is some research done on that, and even a few people moving, and again that can be seen as following this colonial trajectories to some African countries. So when the labor market crisis was extreme in Europe, people actually used all kinds of routes, and often with some historical legacies, to other countries in the world. But coming back to Asia, this was then the more attractive option, because here actually in these cities they can lead a similar, let's say, have a similar standard of living of what they know from home, and of course the growth of the region per se offered a lot of opportunities.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering, and I apologize if you answered this, but you said there were you basically divided the migrants in 4 categories. I'm not sure how you call them, but those who came in Japan, for example, for the culture, those who came who were more career-driven. And I'm wondering what is the largest group in terms of population? I don't know if you, for all of those who live here, I don't know if that's an answer you have.
Yeah. So of course, this is qualitative research. So one always has to be careful in how far we can say it's not representative for the whole, of course, age group of Europeans and Asia. But from the study, from my study, what I could see is that this is fairly evenly distributed, though within, for the Japanese case, for Tokyo, the majority are those who came for culture. And here I guess we have to admit this is then a self-selective group, because to get a job here, it is quite difficult if you don't speak Japanese. So a lot of people might not have stayed, so I would not have been able to access them. The one group that is not as highly represented as the rest are the precarious movers, so those who really fled the crisis. So there are these people, but it's not like that would be the majority, it's rather a minority.
In terms of your methodology, how did you find people?
So here, I was based here, so I had networks at different universities. I accessed different university circles, where people socialize, attended job hunting events, where the people tried to find their jobs, and I did snowballing sampling. In Singapore, I also had some networks at the universities, and they have a lot of business events and meetups, and these kinds of internations and so on events, and there is very active LinkedIn group. So I was doing a lot of online research to diversify the points of entry in both cases, so that not snowball sampling would mean that everyone is kind of related to everyone, but to get different access points and then start snowballing sampling.
And you're still following these people?
So I did until about a year ago. Which is also why towards the end of the book I'm talking a little bit about their COVID-related migration decisions. Now I haven't done research on them anymore for this moment, but I assume that I will probably kind of try to follow up at some point. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was surprised how that it was feasible at all to. Except 2 people, I was able to follow up several times. And then of course social media helps a lot, because nowadays you can really find a lot of people and at least see what they post and where they are and what kind of job change they have done. So that makes it easier to see what's happening.
Thank you for the presentation. this is, I think, outside the scope of your research, but I'm wondering if you are aware of any differences between EU migrants and North American migrants too.
Okay, yeah, good question. So I haven't done research on North Americans. The interesting thing is I did not come across many English teachers, but this is what I, let's say, not in my research, but from living in Japan. A lot of people I know, of course, who are ALTs are native English speakers. So in Europe, this is just people from the UK. And then I happened to have a few people from the UK, but they were not in English teaching. But this is the people I have met who are often in English teaching would then be from the US. In terms of, also, yeah, in terms of, because at some point then I had decided to look at this European group. But of course, at these events and so on, yes, you could see Americans going for the same kind of jobs, also doing their degrees in Tokyo, I can say. In Singapore, definitely many more British people, given the colonial history. Yeah, there I wouldn't be able to say anything about it. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I think I'll try to partially answer this question being European and American. I think there are lots of similarities, obviously. The one difference is that for Japan, I can't talk about Singapore, is the depth of the relationship between the US and Japan. In other words, first, there are not that many US Americans here, but there's still many more than there are from any single European country. There are the ties between Japanese and US universities are weak in relative terms, but they're much stronger than between the US and Europe. There's American military presence here. There are far more Japanese who are familiar with the US than with continental Europe. So in that sense, that's kind of the difference, because of the relationship between the US and Japan as opposed to the US and the EU itself and in the EU states. I think that's, but there are lots of similarities also.
Maybe, yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe adding on this, what was quite interesting is, and probably a lot of people have experienced that, so a lot of my informants were thought to be Americans by Japanese people. So this was the go-to question was, you're from America, where are you from in America? And especially then about language, people would always assume, and here we come back to visibility or to people being white, Japanese people would always approach them as native English speakers, no matter if they were or not. And in this case, in this group, very few people were native English speakers, which could lead to some advantages sometimes, and definitely to a lot of attention, sometimes positive attention, but that boiled down to people wanting to learn English or practice English. But then also to disadvantages, because they were held to be able to do something that they were actually not, or that they could not represent. So that, in that sense, it came up quite a bit, but yeah.
Gutziger once more. I just want to make two comments. First one, in our family, the emigration started when our girls, the three girls, were in finishing high school in Japan. They said that there are two reasons. They said, no way we are going to stay in Japan. The first reason was much more than it is today, was we don't like the way women are being handled in Japan. That was the first thing. The second point was that after the bubble was breaking down around 90s, obviously they also saw a big chance for them to go to the United States for the university, and they were in Yale, in never mind. So only my son is still living in Japan, but that also has an impact on our grandchildren. I have 9 grandchildren now. 7 of them are in the United States. 2 are still left in Japan. So this situation is, my wife is Japanese, and that is what is keeping me in Japan. And I'm totally retired, and I don't have to worry about jobs or about money and so on. So I can live nicely in Japan. But for younger people, it may become more difficult. So that's point 1. Point 2 is your presentation shows how strong Singapore is, and in fact Singapore is the biggest competitor of Koike-san, the governor of Tokyo. And Tokyo again is totally different from Japan, and the central government doesn't like at all what Tokyo is trying to do, which is very sad for people living in Tokyo. But anyhow, just on next Monday, Koike-san is giving a big presentation at the Foreign Press Club. If you would be interested to listen to her, I would try to get a seat for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Walter.
Time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
You mentioned that for Tokyo, the largest group that you interviewed were people who were here or initially came here through some cultural interest for the country. I'm wondering if that is something that you saw as well in Singapore. From my limited experience in Singapore, I don't remember meeting people fitting in that category in Singapore. I feel that the majority of them would be career-driven professionals. So I wonder if there is such a thing there as the cultural migrant in Singapore, as is the case in Japan, if many of you people in my group here.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. You're absolutely right. So this is why the type of the cultural enthusiasm is really about Japan, about Tokyo. In Singapore, not about Singapore, but about Asia. So this is maybe also the earlier question, tying back into that. People could have gone to other countries as well, but they wanted something that they felt that was different enough that they didn't know. So a lot of the terminology that was used was something different, exotic, Asia, a culture they don't know, nothing Western, where they either had been already or where they felt they knew too well. And yeah, most of these people had moved in Europe and some Western countries before. So for them it was this difference that they contrasted a lot, sometimes without knowing Asia. That was one of the attractions. And then within Asia, what is accessible? Where do I find a job? Where is English being spoken? So then there are not many left, right? Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
You want one question here and one.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm kind of curious on, I guess you spoke to it a bit just now, but the focus on just Tokyo and Singapore. Hong Kong comes to mind as an interesting comparative situation, maybe Seoul, Shanghai. Do you intend to maybe run in the future, or what were your criteria for speaking about it?
Right. Yeah, very good question. So one of the reasons was I was based here. And the entry to the whole research was that I had known my expatriation scholarship from earlier studies and realized there are people here who are not expatriates, but who are from Europe. And there was no research on. And so this triggered my interest, like what are these kind of people, what are they doing here, and so on and so on. So, and then we're here in this country that called itself a non-immigrant country, or is portrayed as such, even until now sometimes. And then I knew Singapore from before, and Singapore is the immigrant country. So the composition of society, the way multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity are treated, are, you could say, on the opposite side of the pole of how countries and societies are made up. So how do such diverse cases, first of all, become a certain, as I just said, it's something about Asia. So how do such different countries still become interesting for the same group of people? But then also, where are the differences then in terms of outcomes because of such a different setup of immigration policies and of multicultural or not multicultural societies? So that's what my question. Does it really all look that different in the end? And a lot of the trajectories, if we look at them, and this is, I think, where it is interesting, it's a long-term study, a longitudinal study, there are a lot of commonalities as well.
The question is also a little comment, if I might, if you allow me. Japan is a quite particular case for what concerns culturalists, because I see this also on two directions. Japan has a very big industry of cultural diplomacy, soft power, with manga, anime, which other countries don't have. So it's a very special case when we touch the culturalist immigrants from Europe coming to Japan. That's the reason why Singapore doesn't have this, because there's no industry behind pushing to promote Japan in that way and attracting also somehow the European. The question now, European immigration historically, it's not the first time, you know, it's been South America in the 19th century, North America, and so on. Asia, particularly during the colonial time, officials coming to, a bit like today, the high flyers of the industry or corporation. To sum up in a nutshell, your research ends at the beginning of COVID, so to say. And in fact, we have seen that the data were pushing down in some way, also because of probably the international restrictions which have been influenced anyway, the numbers of people coming. Now, this seems to be over. I mean, the pandemic is still present, but mobility is increasing. So I wonder, do you see this European trend of migrating to Asia as a niche phenomenon, or there is really a change in the global system of migration where actually Europe is not attractive at all anymore? And like in the centuries before, a part of the internal migration we had between countries, intra-migration, is really becoming a country of immigration. And at the same time, of course, it's coming a country of immigration from Africa. Also, there is a kind of change of shifting system of skilled labor going out and low skilled labor coming in. So this is what interests me more. What is the trend you think overall as a thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry to be long in this question.
Really good closing discussion. Yeah, I don't think that this is the large trend that in the future young European graduates will move out to Asia. Still, this is a particular group. I think that is clear. There are people who move to other parts of the world, there are people who stay. That being said, in the end, people move a lot also where jobs are. And I think this is now where the pandemic is an interesting point. And here, of course, I don't know what will happen, but I continue talking to people when the pandemic had hit, and I'm now on a new research project again about migration, including Japan. And the pandemic has really changed how people think about mobility and about this ease of mobility that they have not worried before. These kinds of people, but also those featured by other migration research, they had not worried because there didn't seem to be borders anymore if you had the right passport and you had a certain degree. Mobility, having mobile lives, maybe even having distance relationships over time, parents being far away, no problem because you could travel all the time. this is something that has changed what I can see from how people think twice, think about probably being rather in a country where they have a certain permanent legal status. So I think in that sense, and then of course, tying back to the labor market, that is changing as well. I mean, a lot of jobs now are remote jobs, and that is, I guess, certain to increase. So how far will it be necessary to actually move for a job that is doing business with Asia to that country? So now, in my new project, I see more and more people being employed for somewhere in Asia, but maybe sitting in a different country, maybe in Asia. So I think in that sense, the way work is being done, that is changing, and also how people feel about mobility and immobility, and about the insecurity involved in it, that at least, and this is I think where it is distinct about this generation, they grew up with not much questioning of that mobility, but really seeing it as something that leads to a better life. And I think that seems to have changed. But I cannot really foresee what that means in terms of where the future migration trends will be.
Thank you very much. I'd like to kind of ask one last question because I have the advantage of controlling the microphone. You talked about the fact that in Tokyo, not only in Singapore, some Europeans were saying it was kind of difficult to integrate and assimilate. But my question is something that you often see in migration studies, that for some immigrants, it makes sense to want to assimilate and integrate. In other words, it's a step up. But I think you can argue that for Europeans or North Americans here, you're actually better off being seen as a foreigner than being seen Japanese. So that the assimilation integration to me is not necessarily the path to quote-unquote success, though it obviously depends on what you're doing, I mean, where you live and what your job is.
Yes, I'm glad you asked this, because this is where I could see a change with those who stayed long enough. Some were frustrated after 3 years and they left in Tokyo. Those who have stayed, at some point got over, often, not all, got over their frustrations, that they realized you can't integrate. This is something everyone realized at some point. And for a lot of people, this in the first instance was a kind of disillusion, and for some it also meant they would leave. Because they invested so much, they really thought they wanted to become part of this society. At some point they realized it is not possible, and they could also see that their friends, their Japanese friends, also socialize in very selective networks. And this is, and especially for those who are married here, this is the point where quite a few people at some point said, okay, it's fine. I have my networks here, I have my routine, I know my environment, and I can live with that. And they have stayed.
I think actually for many Europeans, Americans, if they were treated like Japanese, their professional lives would be much more difficult. There's many things they can do and achieve because they are viewed as outsiders. So again, it depends on what you're doing, depends on your family life, it depends on what you expect from society.
Yeah. So here I have to say, most of these people are doing exactly the same job as their Japanese peer. So they are not in any very specific. This is very interesting. I didn't have enough time, but they would often not even work using English.
Okay.
And this is quite specifically done so by HR in Japanese companies, that they do not use people from other countries for jobs where they use that language. But they first go through the very same Japanese language training and so on job training, and then they are moved around departments. So they have a very similar career trajectory, actually, as the Japanese people have.
I'm not sure that being managed by Japanese HR is exactly what you wish.
That's a very different question.
But that's another issue.
Yeah.
A short comment?
Yeah, just comment, and I don't need microphone. I think a demand side from Japanese companies for foreigners are rapidly increasing across the board, from entry job to high end. My hometown is in Kanagawa, one of the a small city called Aikawa, what's the official Aikawa, whatever. And when I went to city office, there were about 20 people from Asian countries, and they work at the logistics company in Sagamihara area. And they bring their families, So it seems they are going to live here for many years. I think there are a lot of high-end people, a demand for high-end people. It's also quite increasing if you go to 7-Eleven, all of these, convenience stores, there are a bunch of non-Japanese people working there.
Thanks for the comment. Can I just, 2 final sentences, because that, again, I think is crucial. It is becoming easier here to get visas and to get them renewed, and that you can really see, and this boils down a lot to the need for labor on any skill sector. So no matter if, especially service workers, but also, of course, white-collar jobs. So this also leads to people feeling more secure and having it easier to stay.
Well, thank you so much, Helena. Thank you for giving us your time and the benefit of knowledge and research. And we very much hope you'll come back to TUJ soon. So thanks again, and I would like to thank the German Institute for Japanese Studies. Thank you, Barbara. And I also would like to thank the Swiss consulate that helped us publicize this event. So we're very happy to have done this event with DIJ, and I hope we can continue to do others with you. So thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, Helena.
Thanks for organizing, and thanks for great
And thank you to Larissa for recording this for posterity and eternity. So thank you very much.